Don't look at the trees. If you hear your name called in the woods, no, you didn't. If you hear whistling at night, no, you didn't. You may have heard these rules floating around the internet for some time now. They've been labeled as the mysterious rules the people of Appalachia live by, following them meticulously without asking questions, or else. These seem to be traditions set in place to protect the residents of this eastern American mountain range from the dangers that lurk in the thick woods the area is populated with. But it depends who you talk to. Some residents claim the area is inhabited with shadowy cryptids and ghosts, claiming they've seen these nightmares with their own eyes in their own backyards. Others say Appalachia is a beautiful, mountainous area of the country with its own culture, and nothing more. Talking to people who have had experiences, it feels like there is something supernatural happening in this region. I've heard horrifying stories of random screams in the woods, whistling coming from nowhere in the dead of night, and spiny creatures caught on trail cams with no explanation. And these sightings and stories are generations old. The tales of Appalachia have been turned into some of the oldest folklore America has. Today, I want to take a look into the creepy lore of Appalachia. I'm going to share some stories I found that absolutely terrified me. Our first two stories are of witches that live in the woods, and our third is about the most haunted piece of land in all of Appalachia, a piece of land that you can still visit today. And as always, listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Walking Nightmares, a podcast of horrors, hauntings, and mysteries. I'm your host. Please subscribe, like, and share for support. The lore of Appalachia has always fascinated me. Growing up, I heard tales from my grandfather, who was born in a tiny Appalachian town in Tennessee. My grandfather hardly knew his father, so much of his life became folklore. Gaps in his identity were filled in with grand stories. He also didn't have more than an 8th grade education, and all of the history he knew about the world came from the Bible. The way he understood life was from stories passed on, and as he tells it, that was deep in the DNA of the region. One thing he did know, growing up in a one-stoplight town in one of the poorest counties in Tennessee, was you don't go into the woods. Just like the rules I mentioned earlier, there was an unquestioned faithfulness to the idea that there was something in there that you didn't want to see. He once told me that every time he and his cousin would go near the backwoods to hunt opossums, he'd hear a loud scream pierce through the trees, and they'd run straight back home. Whatever was in there didn't want him getting too close. Before we begin, let's look at the geography. The area I'm referring to, Appalachia, is a mountain range that reaches from Alabama to Pennsylvania, as well as the surrounding area where people live. The mountains themselves are believed to be 480 million years old. That's older than Saturn's rings. That's older than trees. Like the entire species of trees. So if you pass through them, maybe on the famous Appalachian Trail, you may feel the Earth's ancientness. They're older than we can reasonably wrap our heads around. And maybe that's why there's so much that happens there that people just can't explain. Those are the stories and warnings that have been passed on for generations. One of these warnings was about strangers. Legend has it that there's a northern Appalachian town that still won't allow babysitters to watch their children because of this old Native American story. This is the legend of the Bone Lady. On the northern end of the Appalachian Mountains, many, many years ago, lived a woman named Mother Tabitha. Mother Tabitha was known as being a baby minder in the area. Though she had no children of her own, she would watch over the young children in her community while the parents worked all hands on deck to bring in as big of a summer harvest as they could. Tabitha was universally beloved for her service. She had a seat at every dinner table in town. She was always welcome to dine with any family. Some felt sad that Tabitha had no family of her own. but most were just thankful she watched over their young ones. But the closeness of this community came with a cost. They didn't speak to many others outside of their own people, so they didn't notice when things weren't normal.
Maybe that's why they didn't realize that the mortality rate amongst the children there was much higher than anywhere else at the time. Sure, it wasn't abnormal for a child to fall ill and die. It was devastating for everyone, but they moved on. Lately, however, it had become a much more common occurrence in town, but no one thought anything of it. One day, one of the older children was tasked with picking up his little brother from Tabitha. He runs from the fields back to Tabitha's house, but when he gets to her porch, before he knocks on the door, he can see through a small crack that all of the children are sat in a circle, making almost no noise. That seems strange, so the boy goes to a window and peeks in, where he sees Tabitha dancing with a caribou-headed figure in her living room. The children were completely entranced by the sight, and the boy, in a panic, ran to get some of the adults in town.
A group of the parents came to the door to see what was going on, but the monster was nowhere in sight. Later, though, they learned that another one of the children died that day from a mysterious and sudden illness. That was enough to enrage the parents, who chased after Tabitha, causing her to flee into the woods. As she ran, her dress flapped in the wind, and the parents could see that it was just her head that was human. Under her dress was completely made of children's bones. Tabitha had been digging up the bodies of the deceased children and eating them. She had been making the children sick so she could replenish her food source. The Bone Lady, as she came to be known, disappeared into the woods, and some believed it was to meet with her changeling boyfriend, who was the caribou-headed figure she was dancing with, never to be seen again. So it's no wonder that many in that community won't let their children be babysat.
The indigenous people called her the Bone Lady, but the Christians that moved into the Appalachia in the 18th and 19th century had another word for the cruel women who tormented their community.
When we think of witches in American history, the first thing that comes to mind are the Salem witch trials. But thousands of miles away and hundreds of years later, stories of witches lived on in Appalachia. This story comes from Patrick Gaynor, a professor of folklore at Glenville State College, who in 1975 wrote a book about the tales he heard from his peers in Appalachia over the last 50 years. This story was told to him by an old woman who had a terrifying story from when she was a young bride in Clay County, West Virginia. This is the Witch of Booger Hole. Around the year 1900, the woman, who at the time was a young girl on the cusp of adulthood named Ira, had just been married to a man that lived in Booger Hole on Otter Creek in West Virginia. The area was lush and green, with a dense forest broken up by a babbling creek full of big, flat rocks good for standing on. On the edge of a big clearing in the woods lived the man's grandmother. Grandma Thorne was her name, and she lived in a log cabin that had once been a schoolhouse. At night, she'd hang blankets in the window, making the house so dark, if the moon weren't in the sky, you couldn't see it at all. Ira had been nervous about meeting her new husband's grandmother, not because she was afraid of being accepted by the family, but because Grandma Thorne had a reputation in town. When she told people that she was marrying into the Thorne family, she'd see their eyes go wide, their smiles unfurled into a tight-lipped look of concern. Everyone in town knew that Grandma Thorne was a witch. In Appalachia at the time, there was a ritual you could do to summon the devil. It was believed that one day, decades ago, Grandma Thorne climbed to the top of one of the rolling hills in Appalachia, cursed God 3 times, and fired a gun through a handkerchief at the sun. Legend has it that the hole in the handkerchief started oozing blood after being shot,
signifying that the devil accepted her offer. A man in town told Ira the following story to prove it. One day, a man named Andrew stopped by Grandma Thorne's. He wanted to know if he could borrow Grandma's prized mare named Old Fanny. He had some plowing he needed to get done and would return her right back. Grandma Thorne agreed, but on one condition. Old Fanny was getting older, and he couldn't work her too hard. She wanted the horse back in the same condition she lent her in. He agreed and took the horse. Hours later, after the sun went down, Andrew came back with Old Fanny. Only it was clear he had worked her too hard. She was dragging her feet and was caked in dirt. That's when Grandma Thorne burst out of the front door.
"Andrew, you've ruined my mare!" she screamed. "I promise you won't know any peace at night until you're as tired as Old Fanny." As she said it, a chill could be felt in the air. It was said like a promise, but it felt like a curse. The next morning, Andrew awoke to all of his muscles sore and burrs in his hair. He had red markings on the side of his mouth from something digging in. His neighbor said it looked like someone saddled him up and rode him all night like a horse. For weeks he'd wake up restless, feeling as if he had run a marathon. They knew this was the doing of a witch, and Andrew never asked her for anything ever again. Ira didn't know if she believed that story. Sure, Grandma Thorne was odd, a little reclusive, but that didn't mean she was a witch. But then one night, in the pitch black, someone walked onto Grandma Thorne's porch, lifted up one of the blankets covering her open window, and shot her dead in her chair. Everyone assumed it was Andrew, but the only evidence they had against him was that Grandma had put a spell on him, and that wasn't enough, so they let him go. And while Ira, in her old age, is telling this story to Patrick, she gets real close and lowers her voice. "You know," she says, "there's a part to this story not many people know about, but I'll tell you now. Back in the day, there was a stonemason in town named Henry. He had built chimneys for everyone in town, including Grandma Thorne. And one day, he went missing, disappeared without a trace. Now, it was well known that he kept a lot of money on him. People back then didn't really trust the banks, so this wasn't all that strange. But when Grandma Thorne heard he went missing, she knew that he had been murdered. She had a feeling she knew who was responsible. A man named Otis, so she put a curse on the man's horse. This was a horse that was as tame as could be, but now, every time Otis went to ride him, he got bucked off. He couldn't go anywhere. Otis knew the curse had come from Grandma Thorne because she was known for bewitching animals in town. The only way to get rid of the curse was to cut off the ears of the animal and burn them, which he didn't want to do, so he ran to Grandma and begged her to undo the curse. She said she'd unbewitch the animal only if he told her where Henry was buried. And he did. And the next day, when he went to get on his horse, he wasn't bucked off. The following week, Ira was standing in Grandma Thorne's home, holding her new baby. She had been married into the family for a year at that point, and was having a few of her friends over to see the child. As the women are standing around cooing, all of a sudden Grandma gets this really dark, faraway look on her face. "You know," she said, "I could light a pipe, and by the time it goes out, I could take you to where Henry is buried." Ira didn't know why she said that, but it felt like a warning. All of the women went silent and looked around the room. It was like Grandma fired a warning shot, letting the women know she knew where Henry was, and she knew their husbands were responsible. And within a week, she was dead, shot through her window in the middle of the night. The word around town remained that Andrew killed her for being a witch, but Ira always felt as though she was killed for knowing too much. This is likely the most well-known story of the bunch,
because the story of the Bell Witch was made into a movie in 2013. But this film was based on alleged hauntings of the Bell family that date all the way back to 1817. John Bell and his family lived in Robertson County, Tennessee, near the town of Adams, though some might argue that Robertson County isn't technically in Appalachia. I think it's close enough, and the story is interesting, so we're going with it. John relocated his family from North Carolina to a 320-acre farm in Tennessee in 1804. For many years, they lived peacefully on this farm, but that all changed in 1817, when one day, John noticed a strange animal out in his fields. It had the body of a dog and the head of a rabbit. John shot at this strange creature, but it disappeared. Over the coming months, John's children also began to witness strange apparitions appearing on their property. Drew Bell tried approaching a bird of extraordinary size before it flew away, and Betsy Bell saw a girl in a green dress swinging from the branch of an oak tree. It's thought that these strange sightings were that of the Bell Witch.
From here, the antics of the Bell Witch escalated. The family claimed to hear haunting sounds in their home that sounded like chains dragging the floor, dog fights, and things gnawing at their bedside. They could also hear voices speaking directly to them. The witch seemed to have a particular hatred for John Bell and his daughter Betsy, as Betsy was slapped, pinched, and stuck with pins by the witch. Strangely, the Bell Witch didn't seem to carry the same disdain for Lucy, John Bell's wife, or his sons. Once word got out about this witch, people just had to see this thing for themselves. People started camping out on the Bell property by the hundreds to get a glimpse of the Bell Witch. A few of them left with haunting accounts of their own.
The story of the Bell Witch came to a head when she vowed to kill John Bell 3 years after beginning her reign of terror on the family. On December 20th, 1820, John was found dead with a vial of poison at his side. His death was officially attributed to the Bell Witch, making Tennessee the only state to recognize a person's passing as supernatural. A year later, in 1821, poor Betsy was so tormented by the witch that she called off her engagement to a local man, Joshua Gardner. Moving on to another witchy tale. Our next ghost story brings us to Old Stone Church in Clemson, South Carolina, at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Folks say that this church is home to a haunted gravesite that no plants will grow on. The grave also appears to attract lightning. It is shattered where there should be a name. The name of the woman resting eternally there, 6 feet below. Legend says this woman is from the low country of South Carolina, and her name is Eliza Huger. The walls around her grave have been built and rebuilt because of the lighting that has struck her resting place time and time again. Locals say that you can toss a coin on her grave for good luck, but that taking one is a fool's errand that one might regret. I don't know about y'all, but I'd much rather toss a coin to Miss Huger than try taking one from her grave. Eliza Huger is also known as the Queen Witch of Clemson. Though little is known about how she lived and died, there are legends that have made her quite infamous. According to some of the legends, Eliza was born to a wealthy family in Charleston, South Carolina. She found her way out to New Orleans, where she was supposedly a bit of a wild child. Some versions of the legends say that 2 of her brothers went out that way to bring her back home. However, they found her there in a brothel, working with a client. They shot and killed her and brought her body back home. Allegedly, due to the unseemly circumstances of her death, Eliza was not welcome back home, so she was buried in the upstate. The brick walls were supposedly built around her grave to contain her sinful spirit. This ghost tale takes us to the high country in North Carolina, to Grandfather Mountain. Grandfather Mountain and the surrounding geography have some of the most awe-inspiring vistas in the Appalachian Mountains, in my humble opinion. Sitting as a patriarch above the land, Grandfather Mountain has inspired travelers for ages. Adventurers come from far and wide to ascend its lofty peaks, take in the splendor of nature, and enjoy the incredible beauty of the area. In fact, Grandfather Mountain is so alluring that many hikers might not want to leave once experiencing its grandeur, which seems to be the case of the Phantom hiker of Grandfather Mountain. The Phantom is said to be an older, rough-around-the-edges man with a beard, dressed in working man's attire that's not of modern times. Some say it looks as though he's from the mid-1900s or so. He's got a walking stick, a canvas pack, and those who have seen him say that he just minds his own business and hikes along the trail. In fact, most folks don't seem to realize that he's a ghost until he vanishes up ahead into thin air. As most accounts go, the Phantom hikes quickly along the trail, passes by other hikers without any acknowledgement, and then poof, he's gone. Usually, people tend to see him around dusk.
So who is he? Many folks believe that he's a hiker who got lost in the woods, couldn't find his way out, and possibly died. Others figure that it's the spirit of a man who just loved Grandfather Mountain and chose to stay on the mountain after he passed on. He doesn't seem to want any harm, just to hike along the trail of this beloved place. I really can't blame him, y'all. One day when my soul has gone out into the great beyond, I think it would be fine and dandy to claim a trail as a resting place.